Okay, thank you everyone for being timely. I hope you all enjoyed your lunch and have lots of brain food and energy for the rest of this afternoon. Our first speaker kicking off this afternoon is Joe Cannataci, who I'm sure you all know is the UN Special Rapporteur on Privacy. Joe.
Well, thank you. So, good afternoon, or perhaps I should say, god eftermiddag. Jeg snakker bare litt svensk, men jeg forstår mye. Jeg snakker norsk. So perhaps I should forget all about those many happy days I spent more than 30 years ago now, um, back with Jon Bing in Oslo in my postdoc days. But perhaps I shouldn't. Perhaps I should um, go back 30 years and try to get you to think about all the changes we've had in the last 30 years, right? Because this is not. So 30 years ago, yes, in my first book was actually published. My first book about privacy was published by the Norwegian University Press. But few people will remember that my second book was actually launched in Stockholm 30 years ago. And it actually dealt with some work that here I am 30 years later speaking again about AI and law. Those days we're working with the Swedish Center for Working Life, the Arbetslivscentrum, and Bo Göransson. This was the poster we had for that conference back in 1988, and that's actually probably the chapter out of the book which I wrote with Bo in those days. And have things changed? You see, when the chap from IBM was speaking this morning, he was saying, and if you're a medical doctor and you press for a decision and it says 42, you want to know why it's 42, right? And we were already investigating that 30 years ago. So this was why I was so happy when Frederick invited me, and probably he didn't remember about some of my previous Nordic roots, but why I was so happy to come back. One of the things that bugs me about this conversation is the minute you talk about robots and privacy, people start thinking about this kind of thing that you see on the screen, or perhaps even this. And that's, I find, rather unhelpful, because I don't really think that that's where the problem really lies. I don't want to say that, first of all, robots don't look much like that, but they look much more like that in my experience, though they're going to look in many different ways. And it hasn't actually been too helpful for some of the talk about privacy, for Stephen Hawking and others to bring up other dangers. And I'm not saying that Stephen Hawking is wrong. I'm just saying from the privacy point of view, we have other issues to think about. And since I saw that we have somebody from Google, I thought perhaps we might tease them a bit. Because yesterday, if you weren't too busy traveling, what did we get? I thought this headline is actually much more pertinent to what we want to say today. Google's plan to revolutionize cities is a takeover in all but a name. Parent company Alphabet would provide services in response to data harvested. And of course, I'm not here to target Google or just Google. Many other companies are in the same game. And actually, we have very constructive dialogue going with Google. But I'd just like you to think about all those things which are happening or have happened. So, and I'm not going to stray, I'm deliberately not going to go to some of the work we're doing at the UN and on the work we're doing on a draft legal instrument which deals with surveillance. Although some of that has depended very heavily on what's going on with AI. If in fact we were very lucky to have more than 4.3 million euro before I started off my UN tasks for a project called SMART, where we dealt with smart surveillance, right? I think the website smartsurveillance.eu is still there, and those of you who want more information, just speak to me at dinner or whatever. But Um, we had about 58 people working with me on finding ways to deal with surveillance, especially smart surveillance. In fact, we had Interpol. This is a family picture, family photos they call it, taken at Interpol, and when we kicked off the picture, the whole project, and we found that there's so much going on from a smart point of view. The extent to which things are smart or AI, I'm not going to waste time on here, but it's very important to try and remember what happens when you set algorithms loose. About 4 years ago, I have published this diagram showing what happens with lots of citizen data going and how it's snapped up also by law enforcement agencies and security and intelligence services. But we could actually amplify this much more if we were to think about smart cities and go back to what I was talking about Google, first of all. Because one of the things that we have to look at is this notion of what we've called MIMSI, massively integrated multiple sensor installation, right? Because that's what cities are well on the way to becoming. It's when we link the video from CCTV to audio from microphones on the ground and connect them all up in one or more control room with several databases, we get MIMSI from a state control point of view. But where are the companies in all of this? And since you've already had some excellent comments from Kari and others about GDPR this morning, I'm not going to bore the tears out of all the lawyers in the room with all some of the details of what's going on there. But in MIMSI, we've often got geolocation built in. Let me just skip a couple of slides because I have to also allow time for the panel to assemble and continue discussing. When I was talking about cyber surveillance, and of course you can see this isn't me on the right there, but somehow that's what Reuters put up next to the report on that they had put on what we're working on. I need to tell you, and you've obviously recognized this guy, but well, perhaps most of you are more lawyers than techies, right? So this is Vint Cerf, a very intelligent person whom I respect greatly, but don't always agree with. So I need to tell you why Vint Cerf is wrong, but I have to tell you at least why he's right about at least one thing, and that's the new urban, what I call the new urban. Because, okay, let's read what Vint Cerf said, right? Privacy may actually be an anomaly. Privacy is a construct of the modern industrial age. In the past, his thinking goes, people lived in small, self-contained villages where pretty much everyone knew who was dating the baker's daughter and what the sheriff had for lunch. It's only when populations started migrating en masse to cities that anonymity emerged as a byproduct of urbanization. Now, I could go on for days why Vint is wrong on this one, right? If you want, and I'm not plugging it, lots of the arguments are available in 500 or so pages in that book, which I published in 2015. But what I need to say here where Vint is right in pointing us in a certain direction is the importance of urbanization. Cities and the way we build them have a particularly. He's wrong about privacy and the nature of privacy, but he's right about highlighting the importance of cities in a certain way, especially in today's technology-dominated world. And apart from some other stuff which we've raised in another book, which we've prepared for UNESCO and which was published about 6 months ago, I'd just like to take you through a quick journey to refresh your memory on how fast things are going, right? So 2 years ago, this made the news, right? And the news was that 1 billion people used Facebook on Monday. And this was in August of 2015. A year and a half later, the news was almost 2 billion people are on Facebook now, right? And the date on that thing is February 2nd, 2017. Is this the main news? Nope. It's news. But for me, this was more interesting news. That nearly everyone now using Facebook on their phones, 90% have gone mobile. Which is why, of course, and this takes us back to Kayla the doll, which we saw before lunch, which is why, of course, I contend that today, potentially, we're in a much worse position than 1984 and Winston Smith. Because at least Winston could go out in the countryside when he wanted to go get away from the screens. But what are we doing? We're carrying our screens with us, are they? I haven't got my phones with me here, but hands up in the room, everybody has a smartphone. Okay, I should have asked hands up in the room, anybody who doesn't have a smartphone. Okay, we have one solitary person. And you're carrying the screen with you. You're carrying a device which is possible of being hijacked by either an individual or a security service or a company, whose microphone and camera may be turned on and off without your knowing, but whose, more than that, all your tracks are being recorded. And let's look at a few other facts and figures, right? And let the headlines speak for themselves. Snapchat passes Twitter in daily usage. And am I really thinking about the 150 million people using it each day? Nope. I'm looking at the video views, right? Because that's especially where the money is and where the advertising revenue is, right? And look how fast this went, right? So this is, once again, 9th November 2015, Snapchat closes in on Facebook as it hits 6 billion daily video views a day. Facebook was still running at 8 billion. And then we see that Snapchat video traffic is catching Facebook, and that's January 12th, 2 months later. And then we go quickly and we see February 29th, Snapchat rivals Facebook. Went up 2 billion views in less than 3 months. And then Snapchat users are watching 10 billion videos a day. And this is now April. In 4 months, 6 months, the situation changes very quickly. Which is why I think we need to talk about what Peter Swire in the United States has called the golden age of surveillance, right? Why? And you must bear with me for a minute here, because I'm going to read this out, especially for the people at the back, for those of you like myself whose eyesight is not perfectly. Let me read this for you. And you have to remember that Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote this, right, long before anybody was using a smartphone and long before most people were using computers. As every man goes through life, he fills in a number of forms for the record, each containing a number of questions. There are thus hundreds of little threads radiating from every man, millions of threads in all. If these threads were suddenly to become visible, the whole sky would look like a spider's web. And if they materialized like rubber bands, buses and trams and even people would lose the ability to move, and the wind would be unable to carry torn-up newspapers or autumn leaves through the streets of the city. If only I could write like that. But smart cities make Solzhenitsyn's concerns look minuscule. Solzhenitsyn was just thinking about the forms we fill in, about the information we consciously give away. But when you look at, what the music of my generation would have called in terms of the police, every step you make, every breath you take, I'll be watching you. It's the electronic tracks that we leave everywhere, right? It's the footprints and fingerprints which we leave every time we click anything on our laptops, on our tablets, or on our smartphones. And the problem with the English language, now, in the coffee break, you folks have got to update my Norwegian and my Swedish, my Dansk, of course, about any words you have for surveillable. If you look at the British or Word English dictionary, apparently they claim it doesn't exist. The French are a bit better. They have surveillable, it exists in a French dictionary, because I maintain that that's precisely what we've made ourselves. And somebody in the panel before lunch talked about convenience, as to how much convenience has driven us on this path of using tools in a way which makes us surveillable, right? Because of course, this is a mouse pad, which kind of reminds you that we're always online. Whether we're inside on Wi-Fi, outside. I also found this picture which I thought you'd enjoy, for those of you who have a more Christian approach to life, right? There are claims that everybody's online, always online. And this cartoon, I think, sums it up rather nicely. There is a general impression, at least out there, that why we all leave a digital footprint, and once it's online, it's virtually impossible to scrub out. And the data on you will follow you around for life. Which is why we need to ask ourselves the question, are smart cities worth the risk? Because when we're talking about legislation for the robot age and privacy legislation for the robot age, it's not just the robots, right? It's the data that you and I are leaving out there before it ever gets to mechanized things we can call robots. Somebody mentioned the Internet of Things. And it's not only Internet of Things as we've mentioned it earlier. Let's just look at what we're aiming at in smart cities, right? And when it comes to smart cities, I think it's important that I digress for a minute and remind you of what has been achieved this year, even formally at the United Nations, when we talk about the right to free development of personality. I need to remind you, just for 1 minute, what this is all about. Right? That we have privacy, freedom of expression, freedom of access to information as very important standalone rights, but also as enabling rights. And they enable you and me to decide who we are and even more importantly, who we want to be. This morning, somebody else speaking on the panel spoke about autonomy. So think about autonomy, right? And at the UN in March, we had this, I think for the first time in UN discourse, this new resolution which was adopted which said, recognizing the right to privacy also as an enabling right to the free development of personality. And in this regard, noting with concern that any violation to the right of privacy might affect other human rights, including the right to freedom of expression and to hold opinions without interference, the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. For that, ladies and gentlemen, is what is at stake when we talk about privacy and privacy legislation in the robot age, right? Because for the robots to do anything about it, or even just to coexist at the same time, we have to see what kind of information we're giving out. In 1983, Paul Sieghart said this, and this is why I'm going to go back to autonomy. In a society where modern information technology is developing fast, many others may be able to find out how we act. And that in turn may reduce our freedom to act as we please. Because once others discover how we act, they may think that it is in their interest, or in the interest of society, or even in our own interest, to dissuade us, discourage us, or even stopping us from doing what we want to do, and seek to manipulate us to do what they want to do. And when I saw that, I commented on that in my 1987 book. And after 31 years, I still can't bring myself to disagree with myself, at least on this point. So permit me to read it to you about, right? Shorn of the cloak of privacy that protects him, an individual becomes transparent and therefore manipulable. A manipulable individual is at the mercy of those who control the information held about him. And his freedom, which is often relative at best, shrinks in direct proportion to the extent of the nature of the options and alternatives which are left open to him by those who control the information. And this is why I'd like you to think about smart cities in a certain way, because the quality of life has just got to be defined by some values. And here again, I'm not saying anything new. Some of the panelists before lunch refer to this. If we have the right to free development of personality, which is established, we have determined now, even formally in the jurisprudence or law or case law, or even the constitutional law of over 800 million people on the planet. But what about the other nearly 7 billion people? if we truly treasure autonomy as a value, if self-determination is part of the conceptual framework of autonomy, then the right to self-determination as a value emanating from the autonomy, from the right to autonomy, should also be something we take into account before we decide precisely what my mattress tells the fridge or the coffee maker in the morning, right? Because once again, what my mattress tells the fridge or the coffee maker in the morning is, as we've heard, all depending on algorithms and on algorithmic bias. And algorithmic bias is something which a lot of people happily are now talking about, and which is something we really need to take into account. But what I want to do during my few final slides is talk a bit more about informational self-determination as a design criteria for smart cities, because that's what I think that if we're going to look at a society where AI is more of a day-to-day phenomenon, then that's something which I think we really need to talk about. So, you'll all remember Bill Clinton's days, and it's the economy is stupid, right? Which is why I keep saying it's a smart city stupid, right? And I'm not going to lose time on a definition of stupid, but it is stupid to lose quality of life, which is what I was talking about in the previous slide. And I want to ask the question, and I want you to ask the question with me, are we being stupid about smart cities? What do others understand by the term smart cities? And try Googling images for smart cities to see what comes up. And the results help you understand the many features that are considered to be benefits for smart cities, but are they all benefits? And are these supposed benefits a double-edged sword? And more importantly, will the aggregation of all data in a smart city lead to an unacceptable deterioration of our quality of life? So basically, if you had to look at some of those images, you think everything's smart, except us, right? Because we're going to have smart energy, and some of us have smart meters in our homes already, smart water, smart buildings, smart mobility, smart integration, smart public services. And of course, you all have your smartphones with NFC, which permits you to go along and use all of this. And once again, if you look some of the other pictures, smart working, smart retail, smart care, right? There's so much smart out there that you begin to think, oh, so is that why Google is so interested in being in first on the act? Or perhaps second? Because the business model, as it works, as it is being proposed, is one where your data is harvested, and one of the ways they propose to do it is by giving the cities a slice of the action for that real money. Now, ultimately, if it's done the right way, we could all benefit, and our privacy will not be that jeopardized. But you'll notice that I qualified this by saying, if it's done the right way. Because unfortunately, up till now, we haven't had a proper discussion in society about what the right way is to build a smart city. I could go on, but I wish to move on to the panel. So let's reflect a bit. I just want to propose to you that if we go back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the social contract, I propose that we are actually have been rewriting the social contract. Or to be precise, governments and companies have been rewriting the social contract without us having much of a say. And this has been going on in the fine print for the past 10 years. Respect, actually, I was smiling because one of the projects we've had actually deals with surveillance and data produced through convenience. The C there stands for convenience. So the problem is, I was pleased to hear privacy by design, but actually, is it no privacy by design? So what I'd like to suggest is that we need to work hard on preventing smart cities from becoming the antithesis of privacy by design, and that we should join in the effort of rewriting the new social contract, and one where values can be properly protected. The question is, who will provide the lead, and what's the medio stat virtus in this? So I'd like to suggest that we should be careful of the part to be stupidly surveillable, right? The arrival of the computer has made us much more surveillable. And mobile devices and our being always online have led us to be super surveillable. And smart cities will make us super sempre surveillable, if you permit all the puns there. Because smart cities will generate so much data that no human can ever analyze so much quantity. So by definition, for a smart city to be worthwhile, to be viable, most processing must be automated, including the automated profiling of individuals. By definition, unless properly designed, a smart city will make us stupidly surveillable. I'm going to jump Edward Snowden here for a minute. I'll just remind you what Zuckerberg said 7 years ago. The age of privacy is over. He changed that quite a bit recently, but Facebook isn't in the room, and I don't have time to tease them anyway, so let me move on. Let me just finish by, by talking about the 5 differences since I deliberately started enjoying myself here in Stockholm, you know, one of my favorite cities in Europe, by going back down memory lane to when I was living in Scandinavia. And 30 years later, 30 years, you know, after I left Scandinavia in '88, one of the things that's happened, I suggest, is it's provided a paradigm shift for the level of interaction between consumer and media producers when the citizen is no longer being a passive consumer. Time-life computers have created new classes of service providers, including internet service providers, search engine providers, and other entities which benefit from innovative ways of attracting, organizing, and presenting information. And the interaction between consumer and media content supplier creates a new class of creator of content, the consumer himself or herself. So we are no longer reliant on journalists, writers, etc., right? And thus we got the concept of UGC, user-generated content. And it's not only UGC which contains user personal information, but the very interaction, what we call transactional data. And some people way back in 30 years ago have been saying perhaps the new sensitive data should be transactional data. And it's not a new idea once again. And the 5th very important thing is the convergence of technologies, right? We have smartphones which enable us to access the internet, which enable us to carry out searches, which enable us to write emails, which enable us to find where we are, to drive things around. And oh, by the way, they also make phone calls from time to time. But in fact, it's something really worth thinking about. Somebody has suggested, the headline is not mine, in the world of big data, privacy invasion is the business model. Now, to go back to the golden age of surveillance, I don't have the time to do it now, but if you go to my UN website and you go to the top right-hand corner, you can see and you can download the report I presented in New York last Friday, just 2 days ago. And that report actually deals with big data. Most of it deals with big data and open data. We're just at the beginning of that exercise, right? We've had the task force work on it for more than 9 months, a year, and now we're in 6 months of consultation, and then we're going to have a public consultation in March 12th, 13th, 14th, something of the sort. But that discussion needs to be brought in together with other discussions. With discussions about Fitbits, with discussions about health data, with discussions about smart cities, because ultimately they all tie in together. And that's why, if you see here, as part of my set of 5 priorities for the UN's mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Privacy, we have most of these things there. Big data and open data, health data, personal data held by corporations, so on and so forth. Which means, let me quickly skip that. And my conclusion, I come to 5 ideas that we need to work on together to prevent this transition from surveillable to surveilled. Firstly, I suggest that we develop safeguards to prevent everybody becoming surveilled, often by giving us the option to be less surveillable. Secondly, we should develop and adopt disincentives for automated profiling. And please think of how much that goes against the current trends we're seeing developed by many companies on the market. Thirdly, and I would say this, wouldn't I fund and increase proper adequate research, right? Because otherwise, without the research, we can't have proper evidence-based policy making. Fourthly, integrate privacy as a value, as part of the value system of the right to free development of personality and the right to self-determination and smart city design. And fifth, design guidelines. We need to design guidelines to develop privacy-friendlier smart cities. And this requires an enormous amount of very detailed work, ladies and gentlemen. Engineers need it, IT engineers need it, architects need it, transport engineers need it, energy engineers need it. Whole load of people need design guidelines in order that we can take the principles of privacy by design and make them a reality. Let me just stop here. I think that the Nordic Privacy Forum is a part of the structured discussion as to where, when and how rather than if we should intervene through relevant evidence-based privacy and information policies. I'm going to stop here for now and I look forward to the discussion with the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, well, as Joe pointed out, you are staying with us, and we're also going to welcome back Mark, who spoke to you all this morning, and our two new guests on the stage are Cecilia Magnusson Solberg, who is the professor at Stockholm University, and Max Andersson, a member of the European Parliament, who has been doing a lot of work on these issues. Thank you all very much. Sit wherever you like. So I suppose I'll start with the first question to these three. What was the thing in Joe's presentation that most struck you?
Well, I'll jump in. We've just completed some work with the National Academy of Sciences in the US on big data and privacy. And one of the issues that we're looking at relative to smart cities is how do we make better use of government data, which I think everyone thinks is important, and it helps contribute to fact-based decision making. In the course of this study, I think we had an interesting insight, and that is that there really is a difference between personal data in its various forms and non-personal data. I mean, we can talk about cell phone activity over here, and we can talk about pollutants in water over here. And we can become a lot smarter in our use of government data without any compromise in privacy, in my opinion, if we draw this distinction. Because now we're learning more about our environment, our climate, and even as we approach data sets that incorporate personal data, we go, well, hold it, do we really need that information? Or is there aggregate data, or de-identified data, or other ways that we can understand transportation, communications, air quality, all of the key issues in the modern urban environment. So I guess my opening point in response to Joe is that there's no doubt that innovation and data lead to better decision making, but I think we need to be very careful that we don't get caught in this trap of how do we make a sensible privacy trade-off, how do we strike the balance. None of that terminology is very helpful.
Okay, Max?
Well, my main reaction is that I really have to start working on the issue of small cities, smart cities, because I haven't been working a lot of it, but it's going to be a very big issue when it comes to the protection of privacy and the way we use technology. So it was very interesting.
Thank you.
I appreciated very much the historical reflections. So it's kind of AI revisited nowadays. And so what are, I mean, changes is one thing, and then what's new, and of course the advanced algorithms that you can use for big data applications and data mining, that I would say represent a true challenge. So don't forget what was the historical aspects, but be prepared for the future and what's going on already today.
If I could quickly follow up on something that Mark said and that other people have said. One of the problems that has happened so far is that in many cases, people have spoken about big data without realizing the implications of government policies in Europe, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, about open data. And as Mark said, if you're just talking about water pollutants, it's one thing. But the problem, and one of the reasons why our report on big data and open data was delayed, is that I have had to take issue with governments, plural, about cases where they put out into the open market supposedly de-identified data. In one case, medical data of 2 million people, and their medical data for 30 years, including every single gynecological visit, every single piece of medicine that they bought with a prescription, etc. They released it on the net, and a team of colleagues of mine re-identified it within weeks, right? Now, do you want to be one of those 2 million people? No. So in fact, one of the recommendations I have made as an interim recommendation until we can sort it out is, if you as a government, although you're under pressure from companies to make that open data available, but you have to remember that that data was given to you as a government for other purposes, for medical care, for social security, for employment, for other purposes. If you intend to try and release it under the spirit of open data, you better make sure that your safety, your safeguards, your privacy safeguards are bulletproof, or else you shouldn't be doing that. Because it's the correlation of several data sets that you have out there which is of a direct risk in this case.
So if I could make 2 points, I agree very much with what Joe said. It actually is in line with my talk this morning about transparency and privacy. I think the problem with the phrase open data is that it conflates all data. And instead of elevating the need for government accountability and government transparency and safeguarding personal data, everything becomes one and the same. And we've actually fought a bit against the concept of open data precisely because of the implications for personal privacy, but not because we're against transparency. The second point I was going to make is that, you know, we've developed various terminology over the years to talk about privacy techniques. I know very popular nowadays is privacy by design or privacy by default, and you have some of that in the GDPR. Over my 25, 30 years, I've been promoting a slightly different way to think about the relationship between technology and privacy, and I use a very precise phrase with a very precise meaning. And in shout out to the Nordic region, I got the idea from David Chaum, who was the inventor of Digicache and other techniques for anonymity. In fact, EPIC came about in part because David wrote an article called Achieving Electronic Privacy back in the early 1990s. But here's my key concept. I talk about privacy enhancing techniques, or PETs, and I have a very specific definition. By a PET, I mean a technique that minimizes or eliminates the collection of personal data. If we can accomplish what we're trying to accomplish, a payment system, a transportation system, communication system, a digital infrastructure that minimizes or eliminates personal data, I think we start much, much further ahead, because you see, as Joe described, the problem when we begin to wade into these large data sets is how do we de-identify and how do we anonymize and how do we do so robustly and provably and to scale, and those are hard problems. So in my world, we would start with as little personal data as we could, still seeking the same outcomes. Those would be privacy-enhancing techniques.
I'd just like to add that the notion of open data is really challenging. It's on the one hand, we want to have the precise definition, what is personal data, what's sensitive personal data, etc. Then on the other, we want to stick to those overall values in terms of ethical vetting, not the least. And I think here we are also entering into the issues of what's the role of law. Do we want the kind of regulation? I mean, the topic of this panel, I mean, the regulation, legislation, and what's our quest for foreseeability, etc. And I would like to bring forward, not least, being in Stockholm, that ethical vettings, ethical reviews might be a systematic approach when conventional regulation does not really help. And we have a system in Sweden, we have a specific act on ethical vettings that's explicitly intervened, combined really with the Personal Data Act. And we have public authorities, and we have a whole legal system, I would say, addressing ethical issues. And of course, I would not say that there are no problems in terms of interpretation and application, but maybe that could be one way of dealing with the frustration quite often associated to open data, reuse of public sector information. What's the difference? Open data not being legally defined. So I think we need also, in quest for legal solutions, pets, etc., we need to also address ethical vettings, not as yet another broad concept, but actually as a tool for accomplishing privacy protection, not least in the concept of smart cities, where lawyers are quite often lost because it's a different kind of environment. Sensors, when I walk to the underground, for instance, what's that? It doesn't really fit into the conventional legal assessments.
Max, I mean, you are a lawmaker, so what are the particular challenges from your perspective?
Well, my main point this seminar is not going to be a surprise to anyone who was here before lunch, but it will be a surprise for many who hasn't studied the issues. Artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things is going to be a huge challenge for privacy in the future. It is going to be a huge challenge, and it's going to take a lot of regulation. That's my main point, and I think this has been very, very well illustrated today. We are going to need laws. We already have the General Data Protection Regulation coming in next year. We're negotiating the e-privacy regulation in the European Parliament right now, which is going to add another layer of more security. But there are going to be a lot of issues where we need, where we won't get things right with a general approach. I think many of you remember the drones here in Sweden, that a couple of months ago they were not allowed to be using cameras, for we discovered that the Swedish law on privacy did not allow this. And then we had to very, very quickly make a new law to allow the drones to fly. And it was an unforeseen problem, and we had to fix it. And there is going to be a lot of unforeseen problems that we are going to have to fix.
Well, I mean, one thing to come back to Joe's point, I mean, you talk about surveillance a lot. When you say surveillance, most people think government surveillance. We didn't really draw much of a distinction about who is sort of operating these systems of control, if we like. So perhaps you could talk a bit about that. I mean, and do we set different parameters depending on who is doing the surveilling?
Well, I think that if you look at it from a human rights point of view, you don't put in different parameters, right? Because if somebody is infringing your privacy, they're infringing your privacy. And most people out in the street, when you ask them as to whether they care whether it's the government or a company, it really depends on which country you are sometimes, because some countries tend to trust their governments more and companies less, and some citizens tend to trust in an opposite manner. At this moment in time, because of the post-Snowden revelations, and because of the Snowden revelations, I should say, in the post-Snowden era, there has been a lot of focus, and rightly so, on government surveillance. But let's not forget one thing. Governments are increasingly, in some sectors, gathering less data because they are relying on the practical reality of being able to go along to the companies, knock on the door, and ask for the data. Now, some companies have stood up for them and got some good PR out of it too. But some companies in many countries I go to just hand over the data willy-nilly. And that, I think, is one of the key problems we have to face. It's not only, I mean, I agree with everything that the previous speaker said, that we need to minimize the risk through minimizing the data and the discussion about pets has been going on certainly for as long as I've been in the business, since '83. But it's what you then really do about companies. The GDPR applies to companies, but the GDPR is just the tip of the iceberg. Once we see the new European data protection authorities come together and start coming up with all the subsidiary legislation, then I think we're going to see a lot more attention to what companies actually do with their data. And once the attention shifts away from governments for a minute, I think that that's the debate we're going to be having for the next 30, 40 years.
Okay, Cecilia, and then.
Coming from Stockholm University, no surprise, I would like to emphasize the need for education, and also in my role as chairing public inquiries about adjusting already existing national legislation to the GDPR. So I think that's, I mean, education, not any kind of education, but more methodologically oriented. So it's not learning your GDPR by heart. I mean, that's of course not a goal in itself, although you need to have some basic knowledge, otherwise you will just be able to navigate within all the articles. But I think we need to revisit the educational and pedagogical aspects, and also bring in lawyers must work with IT architects and IT professionals and vice versa. And it's all old, really, coming back to law and informatics, Norway and Sweden. But we need to educate the new generations, because that's one experience from the law faculty of Stockholm University. Although we have 300 students studying law, they are not all that professional, understanding and managing the ICT tools. They Google along fine and they are on social media, but not that many are actually aware what's going on behind, and the black box awareness that you need in a smart society, supporting privacy. Yeah.
I'll make 2 points. I mean, one, also to a point that Joe said, I'm actually concerned about the availability of public data in the US. Even simple things like the US Census has increasingly come under budgetary pressure, and people are looking for alternative sources, statistical methods, private sector sources, so that the public commitment, paradoxically, to producing public data is actually going down at a moment in time where we seem to be drowning in data, and I think we need to reaffirm the public commitment to public data. But the other point I was going to make to the question of, do we go after the public sector, do we go, the government or the private sector? I hope my credibility was established this morning by my ability to sue the government. I'm not shy about that. But in truth, in the United States, the work that needs to be done with regard to the big internet firms, most notably Google and Facebook, is by far the most consequential, because they are the most influential, they have the most data, they have the greatest impact, not only, I suspect, on the lives of Americans, but on the lives of people here. And frankly, what concerns me is their increasing ability to translate economic power into political power. So it's become more and more difficult in the United States to even criticize the big internet firms. Epic is one of the few organizations that actually has the freedom to do that, because we made a decision not to take any money from any of the internet companies. Now, we would be a much larger organization if we took that money and were quiet when they had some problems, but we decided not to do that. So,
as a member of the European Parliament, I do have an experience of lobbying power, and I can say that when Google is on your side, for example, in copyright reform, it is a very useful ally to have. But when Google is opposing you, because Google would like to have access to people's personal data in order to be able to sell better targeted ads and make a lot of money, and they and Facebook, they are the two big companies making most of the money from breaching people's privacy, then it's a big problem. But now they're trying to sell this as innovation. We need to allow innovation on the internet. And allowing innovation, of course, it sounds wonderful. Who can be against innovation? But it needs to be translated. And in this context, it is most often meant We need to allow companies to spy on their users in order to target them better with ads. And I think that is the wrong approach.
If I had €1 for every lobbyist in Brussels who says, don't stifle innovation, this law will stifle innovation, I'd be a very rich person indeed.
Just a final comment. We also have to realize, talking about Brussels, right, how lucky we are. I can say the same thing that Mark has said, that we have never accepted a cent from any company, but that is made much easier in Europe because I've been able to get tens of millions from the European Commission for all the research that I talked about. And that is not necessarily available to everybody. That being said, working with the companies is a very salutary experience in the sense that in some cases they get it very right, but in others they're obviously working to protect the bottom line and their interests. And I think it's that we cannot do this without a constant, honest discussion with the companies, and the same as we cannot do it without an honest discussion with the governments. The problem, of course, as Mats has said, is when the governments are so much in cahoots with the companies, and I won't mention which companies, that you then find yourself saying, okay, so is this why this is going to go through or not? And we have to be careful about that too, because if you just look at smart cities, for example, and the latest proposals, even you see what's going on in a number of Canadian cities and US cities, and the discussions they're having with Google, and you say, should that be right? Should they take over Detroit that way, or should they go after Ontario that way? Because the consequences, without a the right kind of discussion and the right kind of laws, Mats, which would ensure that certain things get done and make sure that other things don't get done, because otherwise it will be too late.
Okay, Cecilia.
In addition to these commercial actors, I think it's important for all of us to be open-minded in terms of what's going to be the next, not thing, but next kind of major development. And what I can see happening is that libraries, now that might sound boring or old-fashioned, but modern libraries of today are definitely active within the digital sector of society, and you wouldn't believe what they already do in terms of text data mining. And the notion libraries are not even mentioned in the GDPR, but archive, the purpose of archives, research, etc. But archives as a term is not even mentioned in the GDPR, and there's so much going on there. So I think in spite of the GDPR and associated regulation being so comprehensive and also burdensome, we need to be still open to other digital application areas.
Well, I think text and data mining is getting a lot of attention in the copyright reform at EU level. Now, it says on your programs here that we have a 5-minute pause, but so if people do want to take a break, please do so. But I would like to actually offer the opportunity for anyone who wants to ask questions of our panel or make a comment or reflection on how you feel today is going, anything we're not talking about that we should be talking about. If you raise your hand, and we will get a microphone to you. Anyone at all? No. Don't be shy. No. Okay, there we've solved it. We've solved privacy. Okay. In that case, I think we will take our break then, if everyone would like a break, and be back here in 5 minutes for the next panel. Thanks.
Thank you.